Hebrew scriptures the river is regularly referred to by the term or sometimes Yo. The word itself means stream or canal as at Daniel 12:5 and Isaiah 33:21, or water-filled gallery, a shaft made in mining, as at Job 28:10. In one case Ur is used to refer to the Tigris River, biblical Hydrochle of Mesopotamia. Dar 12:5-7. Compare 10:4. All other occurrences, the context indicates, apply to the Nile or, when in the plural form, to the Nile canals. PS 78:44. Issa 7:18. The Egyptian name Jow for the river, at least from the so-called 18th dynasty on, corresponds closely to the Hebrew. The course of the Nile. The Nile is generally ranked as the longest river on earth. Its length of 6,671 kilometers 4,145 mi is measured from its sources, which take their rise in the lake regions of modern Rwanda and Burundi. These sources flow into Lake Victoria, and from here a river passes over to Lake Albert, Lake Mobata, Sezi Seko. Farther north the stream is known as the White Nile. At Khartoum, the White Nile is joined by the Blue Nile, which cascades down from the mountains of northern Ethiopia. North of Khartoum the river forms the Nile proper, and as such receives the waters of only one more tributary, the Atbara River, its confluence with the Nile occurring about 300 kilometers 190 mi of Khartoum. The Nile then winds its way through the desolate Tabligh land of northern Sudan, passing over 6 separate beds of hard granite rock that create 6 cataracts between Khartoum and Aswan. Biblical Sin, the point where Nubia ended, and ancient Egypt. Typical scene along the Nile in Egypt. Nile 501 Gan. Finally, having lost much of its volume, because of evaporation by the blazing sun and the demands of Egyptian irrigation, some 2,700 kilometers 1,700 mi of Khartoum, the Nile's waters empty into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile Valley is quite narrow along most of the river's course. Through much of Nubia the river flows through a gorge, bordered on each side by the desert. North of Aswan, in what was Upper Egypt, the valley broadens out, but the rocky cliffs on either side are never much more than about 20 kilometers 12 mi apart. However, when the river reaches the region just end of modern Cairo, it divides into 2 main branches, now called the Rosetta and the Damietta, after the names of the port cities situated at the mouths of these branches on the Mediterranean coast. This fanning out of the Nile's waters creates the swampy Nile Delta. In ancient times the river had other branches, the classical Greek historians and geographers making mention of from 5 to 7. These branches and some of the canals have since become silted up and either greatly reduced or eliminated. Importance of annual flooding. The unique characteristic of this major river is the regularity of its rise each year and the consequent flooding of its banks that are lined with agricultural villages. This is produced by the heavy seasonal rains as well as the melting of snow from the mountains in Ethiopia, which convert the Blue Nile into a torrential stream rushing toward its junction with the White Nile, carrying with it rich silt from the Ethiopian highlands. The Atbara River also adds an increased flow to swell the volume of the Nile. Prior to the construction of the Aswan High Dam, this caused the river to begin to rise in Egypt from June onward, cresting in September and thereafter gradually receding. On receding, the waters left behind a deposit of highly fertile soil in the form of a thin layer of mud. In a virtually rainless land, Egyptian agriculture was totally dependent upon these annual inundations of the lowlands. An insufficient rise had the same effect as drought, bringing famine. While an excessive rise brought damage to the irrigation works as well as to homes. The concern of the Egyptians for a desirable amount of inundation is seen in the Nilometer gauges for measuring the river's level that have been discovered at ancient sites. Without these inundations the never-distant desert would press in from both sides right up to the riverbanks. Yet the Nile's rise and fall has, with few exceptions, been so regular that Egypt throughout its history was noted for its abundant crops and agricultural wealth. This complete reliance of the Egyptian economy on the Nile's waters was well illustrated in Pharaoh's dream, the 7 fat cows proceeding out of the Nile and feeding on the Nile grass, while the 7 thin cows came from the same source. This aptly represented the way good production could be eaten up by poor years resulting from insufficient inundation. G 41. 17-21. The surging of the Nile waters over their banks was used to describe the forward push of marching armies. G 46. 7, 8. 47. 2, 3, while the Prophet Amos used the rising and falling of the Nile River Medidara and Ense Delta Edsa Nilia for Memphis Thebes no Arman 1 St cataract S once in 2 Nd cataract 3 RD cataract 4 Th cataract 5 Th cataract 2 BRARIVER 6 Th cataract Khartoum BLUEN LEWH at NILE Lake Albert Lake Victoria FRIC in Iowa Nile canals 502 Nile's waters to represent the agitation due to come upon unfaithful Israel. 8. 9. 5 other prophets employed the figure of the Nile's drying up to represent the disaster due to come upon Egypt as a result of God's judgment against the nation. The Nile's failure would not only cripple agriculture and the raising of stock, but also damage the fishing industry and the production of linen. Issa 19. 1, 5-10. Es 29. 9, 10. Zik 10. 11. To retain some of the floodwaters for later use in irrigation during the growing season, the Egyptians built up earthen embankments to trap the muddy waters in large catch basins. Thus when Jehovah brought the first plague on Egypt, turning its water to blood, the Nile itself, the water in its canals and reedy pools, and the impounded waters were all converted into blood. X 7. 14-25. Other features. Besides supplying water for plants and domestic animals, the Nile was the source of drinking water for the Egyptians. X 7. 18, 21, 24 Except during the initial stage of inundation, the water was very palatable. Along the Nile's canals and reedy pools, papyrus plants grew in abundance. These were the source of Egyptian writing material and were used for making boats. Issa 18. 2 The reedy shores and pools were the habitat of many wild birds that fed upon frogs and other small creatures. X 8. 5, 9-11 Egyptian pictures show bird hunting being done from small boats. The Nile waters served, too, for bathing. It is recorded that Pharaoh's daughter bathed there. X 2. 5 An Egyptian picture presents a very similar bathing scene of a noble woman with her 4 female attendants. The Nile was also the principal highway for the entire land. Boats heading in traveled downstream on the current, while those heading us upstream were pushed along by the prevailing winds moving inland from the Mediterranean Sea on the north. Commercial ships from Phoenicia and Crete were able to go upstream all the way to Thebes biblical No Arman. Nile 3. 8 and beyond. The Nile figured prominently in Egyptian defenses against invasion. Its cataracts to the east made the land difficult to attack from the direction of Nubia Ethiopia, while the swampy land around the delta region hindered the entrance of large armies from the Asiatic continent. Some scholars suggest that Assyrian king Sennacherib's boast of drying up all the Nile canals with his feet signified his confidence in his being able to overcome defensive water-filled moats around Egyptian cities and strongholds. 2K 19. 24. The Nile's cycles served as the basis for the seasonal calendar of the Egyptians, with 3 famine seasons. Akhet, or inundation. Peret, the coming forth evidently of the land as the waters returned to their banks. And Shamu, the dry season summer. The period just after the waters were highest was that of the greatest activity. When high water levels prevailed, construction work was programmed to provide a measure of employment. The symbol of the great sea monster lying stretched out in the midst of the Nile canals, applied to Pharaoh in the book of Ezekiel, is thought to be drawn from the crocodiles that have inhabited the Nile from ancient times. Es 29. 3-5 Frequent, 2. Was the hippopotamus, generally identified with the animal designated as behemoth at Job 40. 15. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god of fertility under the name Hapi. This god was depicted as basically male, but with large feminine breasts, the head crowned with aquatic plants, and a fisherman's girdle around the plump waist. Festivals, with accompanying sacrifices, were held annually in his honor at the beginning of each inundation period. Some scholars suggest that Pharaoh's going out to the Nile, mentioned at Exodus 7. 15, relates to some morning devotional act, though it may have been merely for a morning walk or to examine the height of the river. Nile canals. Irrigation canals branching Otex to Acute Muritra Longo, Nineveh 503 Kata location in the S of Moab. Thus many prefer identification with the Wadi Namera, which flows down into the send of the Dead Sea about 17 km 11 MWSW of Karak. The prophecies foretell that these waters will become mere desolations, either in a figurative sense, because of the desolating of the land, or perhaps because of damming up of their streams by enemy forces. Nimrod, son of Cush. 1ch1. 10 The rabbinic writings derived the name Nimrod from the Hebrew verb marmidal.rad, meaning rebel. Thus, the Babylonian Talmud Erubin 53a states, "Why, then, was he called Nimrod? Because he stirred up the whole world to rebel against his God's sovereignty." Encyclopedia of Biblical Interpretation, by Menahem M. Gasher, Volume 2, 1955, p. 79. Nimrod was the founder and king of the first empire to come into existence after the flood. He distinguished himself as a mighty hunter before in an unfavorable sense. Heb. Lipmiddle.net. Against or in opposition to. Compare New 16. 2. 1ch14. 8. 2ch14. 10 or in front of Jehovah. Ge 10. 9. ftn. Although in this case some scholars attach a favorable sense to the Hebrew preposition meaning in front of, the Jewish Targums, the writings of the historian Josephus, and also the context of Genesis chapter 10 suggest that Nimrod was a mighty hunter in defiance of Jehovah. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom included the cities of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Karnak, all in the land of Shinar. Ge 10. 10. Therefore it was likely under his direction that the building of Babel and its tower began. This conclusion is also in agreement with the traditional Jewish view. Wrote Josephus. Nimrod little by little transformed the state of affairs into a tyranny, holding that the only way to detach men from the fear of God was by making them continuously dependent upon his own power. He threatened to have his revenge on God if he wished to inundate the earth again.